Chapter 10, Jersey Devil. When Stalking Wolf gave us a test, it was not a test in the sense that it could be graded. It was a way of knowing what to work on next. The importance of the test was not the results, but what we did with them. This was always the case for Rick and me. All we cared about was the information, and a difficult failure often taught us more than 2 or 3 easy successes. There were always 2 parts to the test, it seemed. One part tested some skill. Stalking Wolf made us run to keep up with him, and for a man as old as he was, he could move unbelievably fast. But there was another dimension to what he did. Stalking Wolf did not say we had to keep up with him, but if we didn't, we couldn't hear what he was saying. He improved our endurance while testing the limits of our commitment to knowing. A limitless commitment to learning was less important than knowing the limits we had and what they were. Our training was a matter of defining our limits to ourselves, as well as sharpening our skills. Stalking Wolf taught us the basic principles of survival. The essential question anyone needs to ask to survive is, what do I need most and how do I get it? Built into that question is the idea of knowing how much each thing is needed and how much each thing is worth. We learn those limits by testing, by experimentation. I may have to pause for the cats, we'll see. We learn, given adequate water, it takes a month to starve to death in a book. But there are practical limits as well as theoretical ones. There is a point after which hunger either takes up the whole of your mind or becomes insignificant. We fasted until we found that after the second day, it gets easier and easier, until you come to a point where you know the only thing that could stop your fast would be bodily decay that comes with death. Okay, hold on, I gotta fix this. We learned 2 things from our tests: the limits of our power and the limit of our will. One was a measurement of our skill, and the other was the measurement of our personality. If we were in the woods and without food, we knew how long that fact would make us uncomfortable and how long before it would affect what we could do. We always knew how long we would have to think in survival terms, and that thinking allowed us to function normally in what would have seemed like life or death situations to anyone else. Most people underestimate their abilities because they have never had a chance to test their limits. A lot of people panic in the woods because they think that they are facing impossible obstacles. Almost universally, those who have survived impossible circumstances did not panic and found they could survive far beyond what they normally thought of as their limit. We knew what our limits were, and we knew that there were probably a reserve behind them that would only come out when the crisis was for real. How many boards? How many bricks? How fast? How far? How high? We were always finding out what our limits were and how far forward we had moved since the last time we measured them. Stalking Wolf set up our major tests, and the most important of those came when we were 12. There was a section of the Pine Barrens which was called Hell because it almost was without water. One of the very few areas like that in the Pine Barrens, because the sandy soil makes it a natural watershed. Hell seemed hotter than anywhere else, and harder to live in or walk through than it should have been. Exploring that area always tired us out more than exploring other places, and it was not a place we would have voluntarily spent the night. I was still afraid then, but my fear stemmed more from the unknown than from any true physical danger of being in the woods alone. The Jersey Devil, the huge hairy monster who lived uncatchable in the swamps and came out periodically to rob graves and kill people who blundered into him, frightened me more than anything else. I had collected stories about the Jersey Devil from all the old Pineys, and each one had a way of telling his stories that was so individual that nothing they said could be a lie. I did not question the existence of the Jersey Devil. So many people had told me that he existed so much more vividly than people who told me he didn't exist, that it was easy for my 12-year-old mind to see who was telling the truth. I thought of him with horror, and although I could keep that terror out of my mind enough to camp with Rick and to go into the woods alone, I had not yet camped out alone, except overnight. There's something about camping out alone for a night that is different from camping out alone for a week. There are advantages to a long stay, as I knew from camping for weeks with Rick. Because you become so familiar to the animals, life in the woods goes back to its normal routine, and you see things that anyone who comes and stays for a day or so cannot see. But there were dangers as well. The solitude and the pure aloneness of being so far from any human communication was something to think about. But what troubled me the most was that I would run into the Jersey Devil out there in the dark. Stalking Wolf said that if we took our knives and camped in hell for 1 week alone, we would never be afraid of anything again. He gave us strict instructions about what area we had to stay in and what trails we could use. If we saw another human being during our stay, we were to come back immediately and begin again at another time. We were allowed an area outside hell where a stream ran through to fish in it and get water, but we were to make our camp in hell and explore mostly within its limits. Nowhere did my territory overlap Rick's. We were given a set of trails to go in by and a separate set by which to come back out. But both our trails started and ended at a large pine tree in a clearing where we were to meet Stalking Wolf on the 8th day. Rick and I wished each other luck and took off on our separate ways. It was late June, just after we got out of school, and the camping was easy. The trek for water was new, and the first few days it was full of interesting detours. Thereafter, I had landmarks, a lizard here, a mouse there, an owl, some rabbits to keep track of as I went by every day. And the trip was a pleasure instead of drudgery. But the nights were difficult. I became good at making fires because the alternative was to be alone in the dark with the Jersey Devil. I learned to sleep soundly without sleeping at all by waking up with the crack of every branch until I could pick out the sound of a squirrel from the sounds of a deer. And by the third night, I could sleep through without waking up to every crack of every twig or snapback of every branch. That night, I heard the first crack of a branch that had to be made by something walking upright. I came awake, as I had trained myself to do, with my knife in hand. Out across the fire, something was moving that was not a deer or anything else on 4 legs. I was dead certain it was the Jersey Devil, but before I could see it, it stopped. There was no more sound the rest of the night. I nodded at the fire with one hand on my knife and one on my throwing stick. In the morning, it seemed to have only been a dream, and so I went back to the pleasures of surviving. I went down to the lower part of hell where there was a field of wild wheat and found a quail run. I bent down when the quail came scurrying along. I threw his stick up the path so that he would have nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. I doubt he even saw the stick coming. There was a harder method, sitting beside the run and striking down at a quail as it goes by, but it takes a lot more practice and it gets messy if you're not quick. There's a third way, setting a short bow 1.5 feet high next to the run and shooting the quail as it goes by with a very pointed 3-pronged stick. The stick thrown straight down the run was the most primitive method and the best, if the quail didn't duck or see me leaning down. I had a particularly good throwing stick, one that I had made from a knobby root. It had good heft to it and a nice easy motion off my hand. I threw that stick continually. When we were sitting around waiting for some special part of the day, I threw my stick more often than I did my kung fu exercises. I rarely missed with it. I took the quail back to camp and ate it. By Stalking Wolf's rules, although we were allowed to leave hell to hunt, we had to immediately go back when we finished hunting. I also took back an eel that I had caught at the stream and some cattail roots to last me the rest of the week, so I wouldn't have to go down there again. I might as well have been a muskrat. When it started to get dark, I lost myself in careful preparations for supper. I put together my fire like a diamond cutter, and I worked continually to keep its exact size. I cooked up the stew in the shell of a snapping turtle I had caught the first day. I savored it and tasted it until eating of it could not be put off any longer. I ate the fish slowly and pretended I did not see the night coming down all around me. Stars came out. A small portion of moon came up. But I went on with my meal as if it were still afternoon. I stayed up a long time feeding the fire in small, precise amounts, and I let myself nod off as I sat there. The crack of a branch snapped my head up. I had no idea how long I had dozed off for, and I had no idea that I had even moved until I found myself on my feet. I crouched there with my knife in one hand and my throwing stick in the other, spot-looking the 4 directions for attackers. I could hear it coming through the brush towards me, snapping branches out of its way as if it hated everything it came in contact with. I was frozen with terror, and then I started jumping around and waving my knife as if to ward it off. I saw it only as a huge dark shadow coming out of the trees with a ghostly white luminescence around it. I knew it was the Jersey Devil. I shrieked at it to make it go away, but it stayed and came closer. Before long, it was too close for me to run. Anything that huge would surely have run me down on uneven ground and tear me limb from limb. Part of what I did then was fear, and part was craziness, and part was the simple knowledge of the way things survive. Mostly, though, it was the reflex that said, when you're trapped and there's no other way out, attack. Like the rabbit that goes berserk between the paws of a fox and escapes because the fox has no response for a rabbit that bites back. I took attack as my last hope for survival. But on the rational level, I was totally convinced that I was going to die, be torn to shreds, dragged away and eaten. I believed that it was so. Whatever was lurking at the edge of my firelight was about to kill me, and I had no escape. The fire flew higher, and I thought I saw the creature, huge and hairy, just beyond the fringes of the light, watching me as if it wondered how I would eventually taste. A miraculous thing happened to me at that moment. My fear turned itself inside out and became maniacal rage. I was still there, and I was still scared, but I was too mad for fear to have any effect. I went flying into the darkness with my knife and stick flailing, screaming as I went. But the thing retreated in front of me and stayed out of reach of my knife. It never slowed so much that I would risk throwing the stick to bring it down. I did not want to kill it or even fight with it. I only wanted to drive it off. Since it looked like the only way to risk a thing like that was to kill it outright, I went at it with everything I had. I believe I must have chased it 200 yards well into the woods before I fell down, too exhausted to run or punch or stab another time. I stayed on my hands and knees, panting with my head hanging. I did not care if whatever I was chasing turned and came back on me, all teeth and appetite. I did not care. I had spent my rage. I had spent my fear. I did not even care if death came quickly. There was nothing left to be afraid of. Eventually, I looked up, and there was nothing there. In the morning, when I got up, I found my tracks leading out of camp at a frantic run and heading back with a calm, measured step. But there were no other tracks anywhere along the trail. There were no broken branches or snapped twigs where I thought I had heard them. And there were none of the breaks in the brush that something that big would have had to make, even going on all fours. There was no evidence that anything had been there, and yet I knew that I had seen what I had seen. I had chased something through the night. I went back to camp and thought about it all day. I had seen something, but nothing had been there. If it had been Stalking Wolf, there would have been tracks, surely, some sign that he had come to check up on me and see if I were all right and had not gone beyond my limits. But there was no sign that anyone had been there, and no marks except my own. I came to the conclusion that what I had seen had been my own fear, which had given ground and then fled entirely when I confronted it. I have not been truly afraid since. My fear was gone. Stalking Wolf had been right. The rest of the stay was easy. I slept the whole night through. Nothing moved in the night. Nothing moved in my dreams. I slept in the arms of my natural reflexes, certain that they would never let me down unless I interfered with them. I slept naturally, without anxiety. The next day, I made a fish hook out of some of the bones and went down and caught a pickerel. The day after, I made a spearing trident and speared a catfish. He hung in the water, waving in the invisible wind of the current until I thrust a foot or so beyond his shape as Stalking Wolf had taught me, and pierced him. The long thin point impaled him, while the two side hooks kept him from wriggling away. Cleaned and cooked, the fish were delicious with a side order of cattail root and some sassafras tea. I ate like a king and put on some weight. Days were lazy, filled with easy summer pleasures: cloud watching, bird watching, fishing. I went down to the sand and tracked grasshoppers, as Stalking Wolf had once had us do. Along the sandy places, between bushes, there are little scratches in the dust where they sat, where they leaped, and where they landed. The legs told me the direction. I knew roughly how far they could jump, and I simply laid out a straight line and moved my face along it until I came to the next set of tracks. I caught a handful of them out of the bush and took them to a bare spot 20 or 30 yards in any direction from the nearest bush. I sat with my eyes closed for half an hour, waiting for them to get where they were going. Then I followed the marks, crawling along carefully to avoid other prints until I found the bushes each of them had gone to. I chose the most popular bush and caught a whole shirtful out of it. I took them back to camp, cooked them, and ate them. I thank the spirit that moves in all things for showing me that excess that could be taken without damage. I stayed my days, being fed out of the pattern of the woods until it was time to go. When the 8th day came, I could have easily stayed another 7 or another 70. I had come to like being alone so much that I did not ever want to go back. But on the 8th day, I took my knife and restored my camp as much as I could, and went back towards the pine tree where Stalking Wolf was waiting for us. Chapter 11. Invisible Walking. I got up just before sunrise, but I did not leave hell until much later in the morning. We were to meet Stalking Wolf at noon, and I did not want to be early for fear of seeming like I wanted to get out of here. I knew that in his camp, Rick was probably doing the same. There's no need to rush, and there seemed to be even more things to see than usual. I was not even certain that it was time to go back, and I had to sit for a while counting off the days by their events. Root Sunday, Gopher Day, the day of the grackle fight, 3 Jersey Devil days, and 1 to celebrate. Yes, I was in the morning of the 8th day, the day we were to meet Stalking Wolf at noon under the clearing pine. Leaving was a mere formality. I could have stayed there as long as I wanted or needed to. My fear was gone, and I had found that living there was easy compared to what I had expected. Once I was no longer on the verge of letting panic steal my wits, everything came easily. But even when the snap of a twig tore me out of my soundest sleep in a heart-squeezing terror, I had been able to survive. I had done the daily things that must be done to keep alive, even when all I could think about was coming of night and the Jersey Devil sitting somewhere out there, digging his claws into a fallen log and watching the sunset. I did what needed to be done. I had survived. And when I finally learned to let my instincts and my training do their work, things had gotten easy. The last part of the week had been a festival. The more I looked at the emptiness of hell, the fuller it got. And when it was time to go, I promised myself I would come there again often, because I was leaving behind so much that I had not yet had the time to explore thoroughly enough. It was one of those times when what I did felt so right that there was no need to ask Stalking Wolf for confirmation. Even if he told me to come back again and look harder, even if the fact that I had had no vision made me take the test again, I knew that I had done exactly and completed what I needed to do. I had the sense of relief that comes from knowing that you have done the hardest of all things you have to do, and the independence that comes from having done something very difficult and important to yourself, even though no one else thinks it's the least significant. I had met my fear, foolish though it had been, and I had conquered it. It did not matter to me if what I had seen was only Stalking Wolf coming out to check on me. Though the distortion of my fear, what I saw truly was the Jersey Devil. And if the Jersey Devil of legend had come in the flesh towards me, I would have acted no differently. The fact that my triumph might seem trivial to anyone else did not diminish its magnitude for me. I knew that things might still frighten me from time to time, but nothing could get me set flying into that blind panic out of which the prey is almost always taken. I was not vulnerable in that way anymore. And it opened up important new worlds for me. New worlds I wanted to explore in their entirety, starting where I was. But I did not want Stalking Wolf to think that I did not have the skill to come back when I should. I restored as much of the landscape as possible and started down the trails, taking them in the exact order they had been given. I was going out a different set of trails than I had gone in, leaving behind the frightened little boy who had come into the woods a week before. My fear would always exist in those woods, but it would have no power over me anymore. I would be able to pass it, within touching, without a frightened glance. The world had been changed greatly, and I did not make the time I should have, leaving as late as I did. Everything seemed so wondrously different from what it had been a week earlier that I kept stopping and looking around, trying to take it all in at once in some way that would make it indelible. I wanted to hold forever the woods as they were, impossibly new and bright. And yet, I was troubled because I had not had my vision. I had seen a number of beautiful and significant things, but nothing I had seen had so stunned me that I would know it for an omen. And that omission disturbed me as I went down the trails. But it did not fog my attention to what was around me, nor did it make me any less grateful for what I had been lucky enough to experience. I did not realize that there was no necessity for my vision to come to me in a dream, nor for it to come to me while I was in hell. Possibly, I wandered as much as I did because I wanted to find that rare sight that is so perfectly balanced, so perfectly composed, that you know it cannot be the work of chance or some blind force stirring up life in a random pattern. And I was coming through the cedar swamp when I saw it. I'd expected something exciting and dangerous, and I was not prepared for what I saw. The light came in slantwise through the cedar skeletons in long, flat blades. A short, steep waterfall dropped like a shaft of ice, and beside it, on a bed of moss, invisible in a semicircle of bushes, was a small, tan fawn. The light came down on it like a spotlight, and some of it hit the waterfall and burst into star-shaped rainbows. The beauty of it made tears roll down my cheeks, and I felt greatly honored and yet greatly humbled. I watched it until a cloud came and shut off the light for a second, and when the rays shot back into the glade, the fawn was gone. I moved away as quietly as if it were still there. The shaft of light still crackled with sunbeams and the mist from the waterfall. It flattened and hung along the water. It seemed to glitter still with perfect rightness, like a flawless motion in the newer, perfected part of some pattern, working its way towards complete perfection. I had seen the spirit that moves in all things, moving through the woods, and it touched me in a way that has shaped me ever since. Every day I work towards being part of the miracle whose glory has not faded over all these years. In everything I do, I hope to see the motion of that force moving everywhere at once, as I saw it once near that waterfall, for only an instant. When I looked up to get the time, the sun was a white-yellow disk behind the clouds that looked puffy gray, like paving stones. Sunlight ran down between them like melted gold, pouring through the cracks in the floor of the sky. I was a little behind where I should have been, and I moved up the trail, picking up my wonders on the fly.